Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here for the seventh installment of my WrestleMania review series. Um, in the countdown to WrestleMania 41 on April 20th. We're here at WrestleMania 7. This event took place on March the 24th, 1991. Yours truly was 6 years old. And I don't really remember this one as clearly as I remembered the last one because this wasn't as exciting. But this one here becomes very interesting as I got older and I learned about the geopolitics surrounding this event and the controversies surrounding this event. What is the main event for this? Well, as you can see from the thumbnail, the main event for WrestleMania 7 is Hulk Hogan uh, going up against Sergeant Slaughter, who is the WWF champion at this time. Now, you may be asking yourself, how is Sergeant Slaughter the WWF champion when we last left off in Toronto at WrestleMania 6 yesterday, we talked about the Ultimate Warrior being the WWF champion. Well, okay, a little bit of background. The year of 1990, after WrestleMania, back then they only had four pay-per-views. So the next pay-per-view after WrestleMania was SummerSlam, and the Ultimate Warrior took on Rick Rude in a steel cage match. But the problem was, guys, that Warrior wasn't as successful as Vince McMahon anticipated that he would be. Remember, I said it was supposed to be a passing of the torch moment, and Hogan was supposed to ride off into the sunset and go to Hollywood, and Warrior was supposed to take the mantle and be the wrestler for the 90s in the way that Hulk Hogan was the wrestler for the 80s. But that didn't pan out because, Warrior really only had one opponent that he could really work with and that could bring the best out of him, and that was Rick Rude. Rick Rude had been working with him since his world class days. They had chemistry. They worked the Intercontinental battle together in '89, both at SummerSlam and at WrestleMania. So he didn't really have anybody to defend the title against, honestly. And then they did Survivor Series 1990, where it was sort of a Battle Bowl situation. Battle Bowl hadn't been invented yet. It would come out in '91 as well, which was a WCW concept. In that they would have the teams of five strive to survive, but then they would have out of those sole survivors, they would make up a team. you know, each each match would have sole survivors, and those sole survivors will make up a team. So you would have a group of heels and a group of baby faces in a later match. And Tito Santana, Hulk Hogan, and the Ultimate Warrior ended up being the sole survivors for the team in for the babyface side. So as you can see, Tito is still featured very much prominently in the WWF at this time. But Warrior, he's the WWF champion. He's taking a back seat to again Hogan. Hogan, he took time off to do a movie. They did this whole angle where Earthquake attacks him on the Brother Love show, puts him out with an injury, injures him, and then fans engage in a letter writing campaign to bring him back, which I clearly remember. Like I said, when I went for my first Madison Square Garden show with my parents in the summer of 1990, that's when they were doing Around the Loop, Hogan versus the Earthquake. So that match at SummerSlam 1990 is the one that people are paying attention to, Hogan's match, and not the Ultimate Warrior's match. Some people say that Hogan doing what he did, hugging Warrior at the end of WrestleMania 6, was what really stole Warrior's thunder, and he wasn't allowed to really succeed the way that they needed him to. But I think it really was just that a lot of guys didn't like to work with him. Ted DiBiase, a lot of the bigger heels in the company at the time didn't really want to work with Jim Hellwig. Andre didn't like to work with him. Like I said, DiBiase didn't like to work with him. The only one that he really had good chemistry with was ravishing Rick Rude. And how many Rick Rude versus Ultimate Warrior matches can you really have? But it was good for Rude because he got WWF title matches. One thing Hulk Hogan that didn't want to work with Rick Rude. So when Hogan was the champion, he never got matches against Rude because Hogan never wanted to wrestle him. It was similar when Hogan went to WCW in '94, which we'll be talking about a little bit because this isn't about WrestleMania and has nothing really to do with Hogan and WCW. But that's just an aside that Rick Rude only got WWF title matches when Warrior was champion. So they know what they have to do. They have to take the belt off the Ultimate Warrior and somehow get it back on Hulk Hogan. Now Vince doesn't want to do the babyface versus babyface matches because the buys for WrestleMania 6 were relatively low by comparison to say WrestleMania 5 when it was a heel versus babyface program. So once again, they're turned off by the concept of babyface versus babyface, just like they were in the 70s, where Vince McMahon is convinced that this concept doesn't work. And in general, he's right. You know what I mean? I mean, we look at the best matches that we've ever known in professional wrestling, the greatest rivalries that we've known in professional wrestling, and they've usually been heel versus babyface. They usually have not been babyface versus babyface because people point to, like David often does, WrestleMania 17, where WrestleMania 17 it says the greatest WrestleMania of all time. And yes, Stone Cold Steve. When we get to that, we'll talk about it. Stone Cold Steve Austin was a babyface, and The Rock was a babyface. But Stone Cold Steve Austin didn't leave as a babyface; he left as a heel. And Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 12, which is another one we'll get to, was also heel. I mean, babyface versus babyface, but it was more of a technical contest because it was the gimmick of the Iron Man match, the 60-minute Iron Man match. So, that was a little bit different. So, point being, Vince doesn't want to do a rematch between Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior to get the belt off Warrior back onto Hogan. So, he needs a transitional champion. And at this time, we're introduced to it for the first time in the WrestleMania series. We're introduced to uh, Sergeant Slaughter, aka Bob Remus, um, who is going to be Hulk Hogan's opponent. Now, Bob Remus is coming back to the WWE from the AWA. We talked a little bit about Sergeant Slaughter when we talked about the inspiration for Starrcade '83 and how he and his partner Don Kernoodle and their feud with Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood was the impetus for Jim Crockett to want to do his closed circuit show that eventually became Starrcade. But to recap his career a little bit, he breaks into the business in 1972. Initially trained by Vern Gagne in the AWA because he's a Minnesota boy, is Sergeant Slaughter. But he moves on from Minnesota. He works for a while in the Portland territory as well as Gene Kaninsky's territory in Vancouver, British Columbia. And there he's known as Beautiful Bobby Remus. He's a hippie character. But the hippie character really isn't working out for him, so he goes back to the AWA where he is Super Destroyer Mark II. And initially he's managed by Lord Alfred Hayes, but he dumps Lord Alfred Hayes and he goes with Bobby the Brain Heenan and turns Lord Alfred Hayes up to a babyface. But in 1980, he leaves to go to the WWF. And here in the WWF, Sergeant Slaughter has a bunch of matches with Bob Backlund. He calls out Bob Backlund by initially attacking him from behind while Backlund is doing his Harvard step contest. And an interesting point, Backlund doesn't pin him in Madison Square Garden. He beats him in the Middlelands, but he never beats him in Madison Square Gardens. And they bring him in as a drill sergeant. His biography, his kayfabe biography, was that he was a Marine. He served in uh, the Vietnam War, which he gets the inspiration from a Jackie Gleason movie as a mean Marine drill sergeant, and that's his gimmick. And he's managed by the Grand Wizard Ernie Roth. In 1981, he has a revolutionary match, um, a match that was different for its kind in the WWF territory anyway, called an alley fight with Pat Patterson. And this is a match with no referee in Madison Square Garden, and they're dressed in street clothes. It was basically a proto hardcore match. It makes the rounds among the early tape traders of that time. But the Iron Sheik is now in the company, and after the Iron Sheik loses the WWF Championship to Hulk Hogan, he needs somebody else to work with. So they turn Sergeant Slaughter into a babyface, and Sergeant Slaughter has a tremendous feud with the Iron Sheik and becomes one of the biggest baby faces of the early 1980s, even getting a meeting with the President of the United States at that time, Ronald Reagan. And they put him on G.I. Joe as himself, and he starts to get that real big G.I. Joe money. And Vince McMahon feels like he built up the character, he promoted the character, and that he's responsible for the character. So he wants a piece of Sergeant Slaughter's GI Joe deal. Slaughter's not willing to do it, so Slaughter leaves. He leaves the company in '84, and he goes back to the AWA, and he stays in the AWA until he's coming back here in 1991. Now, the world has changed a lot in 1991 in the sense that the old rivalries of the Iron Sheik, of Nikolai Volkov, those type of rivalries with Iran and with the Soviet Union, especially with the Soviet Union, are no more. The Soviet Union now in the real world has collapsed, has separated. In 1991, that was the end of the Soviet Union. So the character on TV of Nikolai Volkov is now a babyface. So and another thing that has collapsed is the AWA. The AWA is also no more. So Sergeant Slaughter is looking for a job. So he calls up Vince McMahon, and Vince McMahon tells him, "Listen, I need a new heel. I need a new anti-American heel because Nikolai Volkov is not working out anymore because he's a babyface." So Vince comes up with the idea that Slaughter will now be anti-American. Slaughter will come out um, uh, at SummerSlam 1990, and he will insult the American audiences. He will tell the American audience that they have gone soft, that he is no longer proud to be an American. He is no longer proud of his country. That he is now proud on the Brother Love show at SummerSlam, right? He is proud of Iraq. He is proud that Iraq is doing the right thing. That Iraq is showing strength, that Iraq is showing brutality, and he is proud of Iraq. And he has now sided with Iraq because what is Iraq doing in the summer of 1990? In August of 1990, Iraq invaded its neighbor Kuwait. Now, there are many. David says he was born in 1991 when Hogan won the WWF title. Okay, cool, David. There are many reasons why people say that Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq. Some say he owed a debt to Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait because some say they owed him a debt because they pretty much financed his decades-long war with Iran. Some say that it was a feeling of Iraqi nationalism or Iraqi irredentism because before Sykes-Picot and the British got involved, Kuwait was part of Iraq. before the British really carved that up at the end of World War One. Historically, Kuwait was part of Iraq, but it served the purpose of the British and later the Americans to have these Gulf oil states on their side, and some should say it was greed over oil. You know what I mean? Saddam had a lot of debts after the decades-long war with Iran, and he needed to pay those off. So some say that's why he did it. He did it in August of 1990. So Slaughter is coming out, and he's saying, "I like Saddam. I'm siding with Saddam," and he becomes an Iraqi sympathizer. Now, when he makes this statement, the United States is not yet in the war with Iraq, right? They have not yet joined the coalition to fight. Right. David saying Hulk Hogan defeated Sergeant Slaughter. Yes. They have not yet joined the coalition to fight against Saddam in August when Sergeant Slaughter makes his allegiance and comes out as a heel. But come January, come Royal Rumble time, the United States has declared war in Iraq, and this is the first on the ground military engagement that the United States has had since the end of the Vietnam War in the 1970s. So this is a really historic moment. So Vince McMahon thinks initially when he started the angle, we weren't in war with Iraq. Iraq had just invaded Kuwait. That was all that was happening. It was similar to what was happening what's happening right now. We're not at war with Russia right now. Some of us tacitly support the Ukrainians because they're being invaded, but we don't have troops on the ground in Russia or in the Ukraine or in anywhere in Eastern Europe. And it was similar to that when the angle started. But by the time they planned to put the title on Slaughter and have him defeat the Ultimate Warrior at Royal Rumble 1991, we are in a real war. The war is really going on in real life. It's not just a theoretical wrestling war like you sometimes see. That's fine. Nobody cares about, theoretical kayfabe wars. But when it spills over into real life and it's a real life war, then it's something serious. Yeah. So, but of course, Vince didn't anticipate that would happen. Nobody did. But our president at the time, President George H.W. Bush, felt that Saddam Hussein's actions of invading a sovereign country like Kuwait was very similar to Hitler's actions in World War II when he invaded Poland in 1939. So he felt the United States should take action in defending this ally. So now we're in a real war. But Vince decides, you know what? Vince also makes a decision, and he decides, I'm going to go through with the plan. I'm going to put the belt on the heel Sergeant Slaughter. That's an Iraqi sympathizer, and I'm going to capitalize on the real war. So the Royal Rumble starts out with Sherry getting on her knees, begging the Ultimate Warrior for a title shot. The Ultimate Warrior is still a champion right now. And at first he says no, and then finally he says, he gives in and says, yeah. Macho King Randy Savage feels insulted. So what does he do? He helps Sergeant Slaughter defeat the Ultimate Warrior. So going into WrestleMania 7, Sergeant Slaughter is the champion. But also, the Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage now have this rivalry because this is going to be the semi-main for WrestleMania 7. And that is the retirement match of the Ultimate Warrior and Macho Man Randy Savage. Career versus career. The loser has to leave the WWF. So how's it going along with this Sergeant Slaughter angle? He's coming out. He's got curly toe boots now. He's got General Adnan. He's got Colonel Mustafa, who is the Iron Sheik. General Adnan is Adnan al-Kaisi. A famous Middle Eastern villain from the AWA, the famous Middle Eastern villain from the WWF days. Interesting though, Sheikh Adnan Al Qaisi what actually went to high school with the real Saddam Hussein. He's really from Iraq, and he went to high school with the real Saddam Hussein. And for a while, he had his own wrestling league over there in Iraq because he came to the United States and he learned to wrestle. And originally, he went under the gimmick of Billy White Wolf. And so he was an Iraqi that went to high school with Saddam Hussein, but he played a Native American on TV, on TV. And of course, with the Iron Sheik, there's a bit of irony there because, well, he needs a job because he was fired from WCW when George Scott brought him in, right? So he needs a job, but they tell him you got to be Iraqi this time. And it's weird that the Iron Sheik is Iraqi because his country, Iran, was in the war with Iraq for most of the 1980s, and they are sworn enemies. And Saddam Hussein was a vicious, brutal dictator to people like the Iron Sheik, people like that belong to the Iron Sheik's religion, which is Shia Islam. There's always been animosity in Iraq, even to this day, between the Shia majority, mostly located in the south, and the Sunni minority, which Saddam belonged to, and the Shia minority, which the Iron Sheik, the Shia branch of Islam, which the majority of Iraqis belong to, and which almost all Iranians belong to. There's always been that animosity. The actual war between Shias and Sunnis started in Iraq, a city called Karbala, with the martyrdom of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam's grandson, Hussein. But anyway, Sheikh doesn't really care. He needs the money, so he comes in as Colonel Mustafa. And there you have your trio. But how's this going over? This is not going over well. Fans are disliking this. Fans are hating, in fact, this storyline to the point where WWE last year, the previous year, WrestleMania 6, had advertised that WrestleMania 7 would be in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. It will be an outdoor show, and they were planning to help more people than the Pontiac Silverdome. So they were planning to outdo WrestleMania 3 with their attendance records. But ticket sales are real low. Fans are not feeling Vince McMahon exploiting the real-life war for a wrestling angle. And neither are a lot of the celebrities that were booked for it. Roseanne Barr was booked for it. She dropped out. Bob Costas, who had a long relationship with the WWE, going back to the early 80s. He actually called, I think he was on the call during the famous 1986 Paul Orndorff Hulk Hogan match in Toronto. So he was going to do WrestleMania 7. He drops out because he finds the angle very tasteless. A lot of people, and they wanted to go even further. Jesse Ventura, before he leaves WWF, he suggests that Sergeant Slaughter burn the American flag. Slaughter doesn't do that. He burns the Hulkamania shirt in the lead up to this, but still people are finding this very tasteless. He's coming out with doctored pictures of himself with Saddam Hussein, saying that the curly-toed boots were given to him by Saddam Hussein. All the while, Saddam Hussein is slaughtering people. He's killing people. He's killing Kurds. He's killing Shias. He's invading Kuwait, a sovereign nation. Like, people are looking at him as the 1990s version of Adolf Hitler. Now, granted, people will say, well, wrestling has always taken advantage of these foreign heels, right? There's always been foreign heels. Hans Schmidt, Fritz von Erich, Baron von Raschke, right? These were Nazi guys. These guys goose-stepped and everything, right? Waldo von Erich. Yes, But when did they appear on wrestling TV? The first German heel appeared on wrestling TV in the early 1950s. World War II, was over in 1945. Yes, people still have memories of um, the Nazis, and they still have memories of the Japanese. So, of course, this would give them heat, right? These heel wrestlers, it would give them heat in the late 40s and early 50s, especially the early 50s. But the war was over. They weren't doing it when the war was still going on, and they weren't doing it on a national stage either, because people will talk about, what about Pak Sun Nam, who was the heel that turned Dusty Rhodes in 1974. Vietnam was still basically going on until like 75 with the fall of Saigon, right? But that wasn't on a national stage, though. That was in Florida and Florida alone. That was just local. This was a national and increasingly international stage that this was happening, and the war was actually happening as they were doing this. And this people felt this was tasteless. And Sergeant Slaughter was receiving death threats at his home because he had to put himself on the line and be the heel. He had to be the heel, saying that he was against America and pro Saddam Hussein. You know what I mean? And they couldn't really take the chances, with having it in a big stadium like that. But Vince pushed on. Vince continued to do this angle, which was really stupid of him. He lost a lot of sponsorships with this. But despite that, some celebrities still kept on. Alex Trebek from Jeopardy was there. Regis Philbin was there. Willie Nelson was there. So we start off. The first match is Coco Beware defeating the Brooklyn Brawler, which is a dark match. Yeah, Coco Beware. We haven't really talked much about him. He was, as you recall, last year he did the opening match too against Rick Martel. He was also at WrestleMania. Some of the early WrestleManias. His time, he was like the Bushwhackers in a way, guys. His time in the WWE, his time in the WWF was it kind of turned him really cartoonish, really gimmicky with the bird Frankie he would come out with. When he was in Memphis, he was Coco Ware. He wasn't Coco Beware, and he was part of a tag team with Noville Austin called the PYTs, which was basically Michael Jackson impersonating tag team, a black version of the Rock and Roll Express. Jerry Jarrett was into popular music. Like he took Van Halen and he made them into a tag team. The Rock and Roll Express, he did the same thing with black popular music, taking Michael Jackson and making him and Noville Austin and Coco Ware into a tag team. So Coco Ware was more serious in Memphis than he was in the WWE. By the time he came to the WWE, he was the Birdman. He came out with a bird. He flapped his hands like wings. It was a really stupid gimmick, and he was basically a jobber. But which is why fans objected to him going in the Hall of Fame in 2009. Uh, and then the first televised match is the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty defeating Barbarian and Haku. The Rockers we talked about. Barbarian we talked about, of course, too. Haku, they're now managed by Bobby the Brain Heenan, which is why Hacksaw Jim Duggan does the call for this match, and not Bobby the Brain Heenan, but Bobby the Brain Heenan will be on the call for the rest of this event when he's not managing somebody. The Texas Tornado defeats Dino Bravo with Jimmy Hart by pinfall. Texas Tornado we didn't talk about. Of course, many people know is Kerry Von Erich, a member of the famous Von Erich family. Fritz Von Erich's son. Basically, many people know I have a video on my channel both about the movie The Iron Claw as well as the life of the Von Erichs. They're a wrestling family out of Dallas, Texas. Um, Kerry Von Erich, at this time when he came into the WWF in 1990, was already uh, a former NWA champion. He won the NWA championship in 1984 after the death of his brother David on the David Von Erich Memorial Show against Ric Flair. But he continued to have his drug problems as well. He unfortunately lost his foot in 1986 in a motorcycle accident. But he continued to wrestle after that, pretty much kayfabing it until until an episode of AWA on ESPN. Colonel De Beers was putting him in a figure four leg lock and pulled his prosthesis off of his leg, and he kind of looked embarrassed, and then people knew about it, and because people knew about it, when they got to Super Clash '88, it was a Super Clash. Of course, was we talked about the interpromotional World Class Championship Wrestling against the champion, which was him, against the AWA champion Jerry Lawler. Vince McMahon calls up the Illinois State Athletic Commission because they're holding the event in Chicago. He calls up the Illinois State Athletic Commission saying, listen, how is this promotion? How is AWA allowed to have a one-legged wrestler when that's against, state rules, the state jurisdiction? They don't listen. They have it anyway. But the hypocritical part of it is Vince, 2 years later, after he snitched on them to the Illinois State Athletic Commission, he hires Kerry Von Erich. So if it's unsafe for Kerry Von Erich in '88 to wrestle wrestle with 1 foot, why is it safe for him to wrestle with 1 foot when he's wrestling for you 2 years later? Vince with his typical hypocrisy. But later on in 1987, Kerry Von Erich loses yet another brother. He loses his brother Mike. He suffers an infection in Tel Aviv, Israel, and he gets brain damage, and then he unfortunately commits suicide. He unalives himself. So by this time, Kerry's the first of his brothers to make it to the big time. Vince really always had his sights on Kerry Von Erich. They say that before Vince brought over Hogan in '84, he had his sights set on Kerry Von Erich because Kerry was already a big star. He was about ready to win the NWA championship. Before that, David was. When Vince McMahon launched the All American Wrestling show, which was his first show on USA Network in '83, he featured the Von Erichs. You know what I mean? He featured stars from all the territories, and he featured matches with the Von Erichs and the Freebirds at that time. So he finally got him, but he switched his name, for copyright reasons. He was the Texas Tornado, whatever. But Kerry does win, or during his WWF run, he does win the Intercontinental Championship. He doesn't allow him to use the claw. Vince McMahon hated the claw. The claw, of course, goes back to Kerry's family. That was his father's finishing maneuver. But Vince McMahon hates the claw, so he has to use the discus punch. As many people know, Kerry Von Erich was a discus player. He was going to go to the Olympics in 1979 when abruptly President Jimmy Carter at that time pulled out of the Olympics because of protesting Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. So he never got to go, and from there he went directly into wrestling. So Kerry is here against Dino Bravo. Both guys Both guys, ironically, would pass away in 1993. The controversy surrounding Dino Bravo is very interesting. Supposedly, Dino Bravo had gotten into trouble with the mafia in Montreal, and they retaliated him for the sale of illegal cigarettes and killed him. And of course, Kerry Von Erich would commit suicide as well in 1993 after being let go a year before by the WWF. The British Bulldog defeated the Warlord with Slick by pinfall. Now, the British Bulldog, uh, he left he left WWE in the late '80s with his partner and cousin, the Dynamite Kid, because of backstage fights that they had with the Rougeau brothers. But now he has resurfaced. He has a whole new look. They originally went back to the Calgary territory because, as I said, Bruce Hart tried to build up the Calgary territory once again, but it was unsuccessful. So they went back to the Calgary territory. They tried to also help and rebuild it. It was unsuccessful. Then Davey, um, because of an injury that he suffered in a match in Hamilton, Ontario, in the '80s, Dynamite Kid's injury had gotten worse, and he had to retire from wrestling, and eventually ended up wheelchair bound. But Davey had to feed his family. He knew he had a family, so he went back to the WWF, all new look, braids, like the super British guy now, the super British Patriot. And this is a pretty good match with him and the Warlord. This is a slept on match. The Warlord now is also a singles wrestler. He was previously teaming with the Barbarian as a member of Powers of Pain, but he is now a singles wrestler. Um, the Nasty Boys defeat Jerry Saggs and Brian Knobbs, and I wanted to say prayers up for Brian Knobbs. According to all reports, he suffered leg amputation due to complications with diabetes um, recently. And I was always a fan of the Nasty Boys. I had the Nasty Boys. I had the Brian Knobbs action figure as a kid. I took it with me to camp in '96, and a counselor stole it. I actually saw it in the counselor's room, and I went to him and confronted that counselor and said, "Hey, wait a minute, you have my Nasty Boys toy in there," and I got it back. Eventually, I gave it away with all my other wrestling action figures to a neighbor of mine. But that was very interesting. That was one of the first figures that I had. I love the Nasty Boys because when they first came out, they reminded me of Bebop and Rocksteady, the two villains from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And they started off in the AWA in the 1980s. Well, when the national audience really got a hold of them, they're originally from Pennsylvania. When the national audience really got a hold of them was in 1990 when they wrestled the Steiner brothers at Halloween Havoc, a hell of a match. So somebody from the WWF calls them up after that Halloween Havoc match against the Steiners, and they come in with Jimmy Hart as their manager, wrestling initially the Legion of Doom. And interference from Power and Glory allows them to become number one contenders to the Hart Foundation's championships. The Hart Foundation, of course, won the tag team titles at SummerSlam 1990. This, that I said, was an incredible match. Now the Demolition is now a trio because Bill Eadie had a shellfish injury, so they took Bill Eadie off the road, and they now bring in Crush, Brian Adams, as the third member of Demolition. So now there's a free bird type rule going on with Demolition. But by the time we get to WrestleMania 7, Bill Eadie is no longer a member of Demolition, and it's just smash and crush. But the Legion of Doom, aka the Road Warriors, they've come into the company. Capital Combat 1990 was their last event that they did for WCW. After that, they finally got fed up with WCW, left the company, and they come into the WWF, helping the Hart Foundation win the tag team championships again. So they feuded with the Nasty Boys for a while, but the Hart Foundation lose this match. Jimmy Hart, their former manager, tosses in the megaphone. Brian Knobs hits him with it, and they win the championships. It'll go on at SummerSlam 1991, an event that took place on my birthday, right, my 7th birthday. The Nasty Boys will take on LOD, and LOD will win the WWF Tag Team Championships for the first time. But now, right now, the Nasty Boys are the champions. They became that at WrestleMania 7. Uh, from there, we move on to Jake Roberts defeating Rick Martel. I said last time that Rick Martel was now a heel. He's the model. He's walking around with this arrogance, which is his perfume. He sprays it in the eye of Jake the Snake Roberts on an episode of the Brother Love Show. Now, Jake the Snake Roberts is blind. So the concept for this match is a blindfold match. Both guys will be wearing blindfolds, and it'll be up to the fans to tell each wrestler where the other guy is. This is a very funny match. A lot of people say that they don't like this match. You know, a lot of people say, "Oh, this match sucks." You know, how can you like this match? And then it was obvious because Jake Roberts sticks his hand in the mask, and you can see him move his hand around. You know, the blindness angle sometimes works. It worked with JYD in '79. It worked with the Sandman later on in ECW. It sometimes does work, where a wrestler will go blind for whatever reason. And Chris Adams comes to mind too in World Class Championship Wrestling. In the angle with Gino Hernandez right before Gino Hernandez passed away. You know what I mean? So it sometimes worked, but this whole blindfold match, they never did this again. And you know, like I said, I found it a fun match, a fun concept, but a lot of people didn't. Next, we have the debut of the Undertaker. Now, this is going to be the stuff of legend, guys. This is going to be the stuff of legend because this is where it all begins, guys. The streak. The streak. We'll be talking about the streak a lot. And this is where the streak begins. The streak is part of WrestleMania lore. Yes, the Undertaker streak. Now, who is the Undertaker? The Undertaker is Mark Calloway. He breaks into the business in the mid 80s. In World Class Championship Wrestling, he is trained by Buzz Sawyer. And he has a few stints in Memphis and a few stints in World Class, where in World Class, he's managed by Percy Pringle, who's somebody who will become his manager in the WWF as Paul Bearer. He also, like I said, he's big Texas Red when he wrestles in Durban, South Africa. But he gets the attention of the WWF when he wrestles in WCW. He comes into WCW in 1989 as a replacement for Sid. Sid is injured, and Sid is part of a tag team with Danny Spivey called the Skyscrapers. But when he's injured, Teddy Long, who is the manager of this team, brings in Mean Mark Callis. And Mean Mark Callis, for a while, throughout the remainder of 1989, is a member of this tag team. But then by 1990, he goes on his own and he becomes managed by Paulie Dangerously. And it's during the Great American Bash 1990, where he has a match with Lex Luger, that he gets the attention of Vince McMahon. Now, Hulk Hogan claims And actually, the name Mean Mark Callis was given to him by Terry Funk, actually in WCW. But before that, he was Texas Red, in World Class. But and another big influence on him was the spoiler, Don Jardine, who gave him the old school move, old school. But Hulk Hogan claims that he discovered the Undertaker because he did a movie called Suburban Commando, uh, and he claims that is what and Undertaker does a cameo in that. But the problem is Undertaker was already in the WWF when Hogan made the movie, so the timelines don't add up. Anyway, it was from that Luger match. Vince McMahon gets a hold of him. Vince McMahon has this idea of an old Western Undertaker that he wants to create, and he one of the most ambitious things that Vince has ever done. This character, this old Western Undertaker, this old Western mortician coming out. And the way they introduce him, originally there's this rumor because Starcade, Survivor Series 1990, besides being that wild card tag team match situation, was also was also was promoted by this big egg that was appearing in the middle of the ring. Gene Oakland was hyping it up. They were hyping it up for weeks and weeks that something was going to come out of this egg that was going to shock the fans. And supposedly, before the Undertaker gimmick, he was going to give the person, Mark Calloway, Vince McMahon, was going to give Mark Calloway the gimmick of the Eggman because there were two mysteries at this Survivor Series. One who was going to be the mystery partner in Ted DiBiase's team, and two who was going to be in this egg. So supposedly, it's a rumor that Undertaker's name was supposed to be Eggman. Thank God, Eggman never became just like Wrestle Tussle. Colossal Tussle, the original supposed name of WrestleMania. Thank God Eggman was never saw the light of day. What did see the light of day was Hector Guerrero in a chicken suit imitating the San Diego chicken. Now I like the San Diego chicken. I actually bought when I was like 8 or 9 years old a videotape ordering it from TV of appearances by the San Diego chicken. So they tried to imitate the San Diego chicken by creating the WWF version, the Gobbledygooker. And again, the Gobbledygooker was total nonsense. It hatched out of the egg, and the Gobbledygooker and Mean Gene Oakland did a do-si-do together in the ring. It was terrible. Hector Guerrero, a second generation wrestler, a member of a wrestling family, a wrestling dynasty, embarrassed to that level. But what can you do? It's WWE, right? But thank God that that Undertaker was not Eggman. But so Undertaker comes out as Ted DiBiase's mystery partner, and this was Survivor Series 1990. And he eliminates Coco Beware, he eliminates Dusty Rhodes. He's a mean beast. And originally he's managed by Brother Love. There's the idea of contrast. Brother Love is a preacher, and he's pure, and the Undertaker's this evil character, and he's a mortician. And he's originally called Kane the Undertaker. Now, interesting, Kane the Undertaker. He wasn't just the Undertaker; he was Kane the Undertaker. But he's like that for a couple of weeks until Vince McMahon says, "Listen, you have to, to Bruce Pritchard, you have to make a choice: either get off the road and be a backstage agent full time, or stay on the road as the character of Brother Love and the Undertaker's manager." Well, he chooses to be backstage, so the Undertaker needs a new manager. So they bring in Percy Pringle, William Moody. William Moody has a lot of experience in the wrestling business. The manager of Rick Rude when he was the WCCW champion. He ended his time in World Class by feuding with Chris Von Erich, the last of the Von Erich brothers. I will. I'm doing that next. David. Um, But when they're interviewing Percy Pringle / William Moody, they found out that he's studied to be an undertaker in his real life. His real life persona is a mortician. He studied to be a mortician. He went to mortician school. So Pat Patterson, J.J. Dillon, and Vince McMahon, they're laughing it up because he doesn't know the role that they have for him as Paul Bearer. So he goes on the Brother Love show, and Brother Love passes the managerial duties of The Undertaker to Paul Bearer. So now he's dropped the Kane part. He's no longer Kane the Undertaker. He's just The Undertaker, and he's managed by Paul Bearer. And this angle is so original. Like there was never anything like this. And at WrestleMania 7, the streak began. He makes quick work of Jimmy Superfly Snuka. Jimmy Superfly Snuka is the first member of the roster to fall in the streak. And we'll be talking about the streak a lot in this WrestleMania series because as years go by, you'll start to see that the streak becomes increasingly more important. As The Undertaker gains more tattoos on his arms, he also gains more victims in his streak. But this is the beginning of the streak. The next match is the Ultimate Warrior against Macho Man Randy Savage. Now, this match is incredible. David, I don't know if you ever saw this match, career-ending match. The Macho Man comes out in blue and white with Sensational Queen Sherry. And the Ultimate Warrior's costume says bigger than, and then it has a picture of the WWF title. It's basically saying that this match is more important than the WWF title. And this is possibly the best match that the Ultimate Warrior has ever had in his whole career. Macho Man hits him with tons of elbows. Warrior hits him with like 2 or 3 splashes, 2 or 3 gorilla press slams. Like people talk about Shawn Michaels being Mr. WrestleMania. In the beginning, it might have been Andre, but by this point, when Andre is no longer an active participant in WrestleMania, the Mr. WrestleMania of this era, in my opinion, was the Macho Man Randy Savage. He could carry anybody to a good match, and it shows it in this match, man. This match is tremendous. Warrior gets the win. So now Macho Man is out of the WWF. His career is over. Now, in real life, it was because Macho Man wanted to have a child, so he was good. He was getting off the steroids, and he was going to retire to be a commentator on Superstars. But it doesn't work out. you know what I mean? It doesn't work out. We'll see next year. He's back. David's talking about WrestleMania 8. We're doing that next. Macho Man is in the main event for that event, so he's not really retired. We'll talk about what happens, but the Ultimate Warrior is victorious here. What an amazing match this was. And in the end, Sherry comes in and kicks Randy Savage. She is now mad at Randy Savage because he lost. And she starts kicking his ass, man. But in the audience is Miss Elizabeth. And Miss Elizabeth can't stand to see Randy Savage being beaten up by Sherry. So she jumps in the ring. First time ever getting physical. She jumps in the ring. She pulls Sherry out from under Randy Savage. She kicks Sherry out of the ring. Now Savage is still laid out. Savage is still down. He turns around. He almost hits Elizabeth, but he sees her. And they're standing across the ring from each other. Liz is emotional. Savage is emotional. And then they come together and they hug. And it's like Gorilla Monsoon said, this is a happening. And then Bobby Heenan said, it's better than Love Story if you like that kind of mush. And people in the audience were actually crying. It was the most beautiful moment that WrestleMania had ever had up to that point. And Monsoon's character says, what a woman and what a man. He said, and then Bobby Heenan said when he came out, everybody here was booing him. Now they're all on their feet. He lost everything. He lost the match. He lost his career. And then Monsoon says he has something more important, his woman. And then usually when they were manager and wrestler, Liz would hold the ropes open for Randy, but Randy this time holds the rope open for Liz, and they leave the arena. It's beautiful. It's one of the most memorable things uh, that exist for early wrestling fans. The next match is Tenru and Kenshi Katao against Demolition. Like I said, smash and crush. This match is a sleeper. You can forget about this match. Most people didn't know who these Japanese wrestlers were. The the reason why they were featured on this event is because pretty soon the WWF will be doing a joint show with New Japan Pro Wrestling in 19 at this time. So they were trying to introduce more wrestlers from New Japan Pro Wrestling at this time. Big Boss Man with Andre the Giant. Now, Andre the Giant is a babyface again. Like I said, Big Boss Man is also a babyface. They've been doing this storyline where Bobby the Brain Heenan is making fun of the Big Boss Man's mother all the time on TV. And originally it was supposed to be Rick Rude against him, but Rick Rude has left the WWE over contract disputes, and he is now in WCW. So they have Mr. Perfect take his place, who is now a member of the Heenan family as well as the Intercontinental Champion. Uh, Andre the Giant is in a really sad state right here because he comes out on crutches. It's we're coming close to the end of Andre the Giant's time on Earth, and as well as in the WWF. So, um, so that's that. Unfortunately, Bossman doesn't win. Bossman never won a championship during his first run as a babyface in WWE. He did in the late '90s when he came back during the Attitude Era. He won the tag team championships, the hardcore championship, and stuff. But the second run, no, not really. He didn't. He didn't. First run, he didn't win anything. Um, Earthquake with Jimmy Hart defeats Greg Valentine by pinfall. That's whatever because Valentine's a babyface now, and he sucks at. LOD defeats Power and Glory by pinfall. Power and Glory, of course. Um, Paul Roma, who came in originally in the late '80s as a member of the Young Stallions with Jim Powers, but now he's a heel and he's teaming with Hercules. They were a pretty good team. Paul Roma was always more of a tag team wrestler in a way. Um, he was better as a tag team wrestler, in my opinion. Not worthy of being a horseman. They bring him into WCW in '93, and he becomes a horseman. Like, whatever. But anyway, that's the case with this match. This is a throwaway match, whatever. Um, the next match is Virgil versus the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. Now, to explain this, Virgil was when DiBiase first came in. Virgil was brought in as his handler originally. And like I said, Virgil was the way to make fun of the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, because that was his real name. And Virgil was basically a slave of Ted DiBiase. Ted DiBiase would demean him. Ted DiBiase would get him to give him back rubs, get him to clean his toes, get him to do all kinds of shit. And most of the time in matches, Virgil would take the bumps, So people were wondering, when is Virgil going to get tired of Ted DiBiase's bullshit? So they have a match against Dustin Rhodes and Dusty Rhodes at Royal Rumble 1991. And finally, after this match, DiBiase is just berating Virgil. Virgil gets tired of it and he turns on Ted DiBiase. So Roddy Piper is now training Virgil in boxing to take on Ted DiBiase, which is crazy. Uh, in this match, Reed defeats DiBiase, but it's not for the $1 million belt. That won't come until SummerSlam. At SummerSlam, Virgil will defeat Ted DiBiase for the $1 million belt. The first time the $1 million belt is put up for grabs, and the fans will erupt. The fans will erupt in Madison Square Garden when he actually does it, and that's Virgil's 15 minutes of fame. Actually, after that, he gets his nose broken by Sid in '92, and he's pretty much a jobber after that until coming to WCW as Vincent, a member of the NWO. The Mountie. Now, who's the Mountie? The Mountie is now taking on Tito Santana. The Mountie is Jacques Rougeau. Remember the Rougeau brothers, famous Rougeau family out of Montreal. He was a tag team wrestler. His brother Raymond is now retired, and now he's a Canadian mounted police officer, which is a gimmick that the country of Canada actually sued the WWE for later on. He defeats Tito Santana, and then we get to the main event, which is Hulk Hogan versus Sergeant Slaughter. And like David said, Hulk Hogan defeated Sergeant Slaughter. This match kind of sucked. They got color and everything. They got Regis Philbin to do the commentary with Heenan and Gorilla. But there was no saving this match. You know what I mean? Like Slaughter had the Iraqi flag draped over him. But Hogan wins the title for the third time. Like I said, the match is boring. They tried everything they could, but Slaughter wasn't a great wrestler, and neither was Hogan. So this match was overshadowed by Macho Man versus the Ultimate Warrior, in my opinion. It wasn't until after the match that Sergeant Slaughter threw the fireball at Hogan, but we didn't see it on the pay-per-view. They showed it in the Coliseum home video, and their feud continues way after the war is over until the summer. Actually, it's a handicap match. Because 1991 becomes the match made in heaven. SummerSlam 1991 becomes the match made in heaven and the match made in hell. Randy Savage and Elizabeth are back together now. So Randy Savage proposes to Miss Elizabeth on Superstars, and they decide to make their wedding the main event, co-main event at SummerSlam 1991, along with Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior taking on Adnan, Mustafa, and Slaughter. So they continue this Iraqi storyline until the end of 1991, and then Slaughter turns face again, saying that he wants his country back. So even after the war, they continue this storyline, even though they gave him a lot of bad press. But that's the end of WrestleMania 7, guys. Other than the Warrior versus Randy Savage match, and the Undertaker streak, and the intricacies that surround the backstage machinations of the real war, contrast with the wrestling war. This is pretty much it's a real infamous pay-per-view for that reason, for the introduction of politics, of geopolitics into professional wrestling, and also because a lot of the wrestlers who wrestled on this card are no longer with us. Many of them are passed away, and the infamous curse of WrestleMania 7. So anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, David, for contributing. Stay tuned, David. I'm going to do WrestleMania 8 coming up next. Peace.